The wind moved low across the hedgerows of Normandy. Mist clung to the fields like smoke that refused to rise. It was June 8th, 1904, 2 days after the landings, and in the gray morning, the war was already changing shape. Engines murmured in the distance. Somewhere beyond the fog, armor moved. But for the men of the French 2nd Armored Division, it wasn't Allied steel they heard. It was German, a sound too heavy, too deliberate to be mistaken. At 0540, reconnaissance officer Captain Paul Folliot sent his first warning. Enemy armor massing near Villers-Bocage. The message passed through static, thin as breath through wire. He waited for acknowledgement. None came. In the headquarters tent outside Bayeux, British officers were already buried in reports. Every map was marked in pencil, every village a question. They believed the counterattack would come from the south, not from the shadowed lanes behind their flank. And so the first sign of danger was left in silence. The fog thickened. A shepherd's dog barked in the distance. Then nothing. Through binoculars, Folliot's men saw movement between the orchards, tracks cutting through dew, camouflage nets trembling where no wind touched them. He ordered another signal. Heavy armor, possibly tigers, estimated 30 plus. Still no reply. One of his sergeants muttered under his breath, a phrase half prayer, half warning. Folliot didn't answer. He simply kept watching the horizon that refused to clear. By 08:00, the fog began to thin. Sunlight broke in fragments across the fields, brief flashes of metal among the hedges. And for a moment, the truth appeared. Panzers of the 101st Heavy Tank Battalion were already in motion. Their commander, Michael Wittmann, records show that Allied command underestimated the speed of German regrouping. The belief was simple. The Wehrmacht was broken, the coast secured. But in those narrow French lanes, the illusion met its first fracture. Folliot's driver recalled years later, the sound was not battle yet. It was pressure, like thunder rolling under the ground. That pressure would break within hours, and the warning, ignored in the confusion of success, would become one of Normandy's earliest tactical shocks. The wind shifted again. Somewhere behind the hills, Allied convoys moved west, unaware of the armor closing from the east. A field radio clicked, faint and useless, and in that hum of static, a truth waited to be heard. The morning light faded into engine smoke. Men adjusted their helmets, uncertain why. The air smelled of rain, oil, and distance. No one spoke. No one yet knew that the calm before them was already over. The fog, once a veil, was now a warning. And through it, history prepared to charge. Engines growled like thunder beneath the morning haze. The sun, pale and uncertain, rose over the rooftops of Villers-Bocage. Shadows of tanks stretched long across the cobblestones. For a moment, it seemed the town still slept. Columns of the British 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, rolled eastward. Shermans, Cromwells, half-tracks, and fuel trucks stretched for miles. They believed the road was clear. They believed the warning had been handled. In the orchards beyond the town, the dew had not yet dried. A German officer knelt beside his Tiger tank, running his hand along the cold armor. Michael Wittmann, 29 years old, veteran of Kursk and the Eastern Front. He listened to the distant rumble and whispered to his crew, "Jets. Now." The first shell struck without warning. A Sherman vanished in flame, then another. Within seconds, the column folded upon itself, trucks colliding, crews diving for cover. The road became a corridor of fire. Civilians hid in cellars as glass shattered overhead. Children pressed hands to their ears. The smell of cordite filled the air, bitter, metallic, unforgettable. One British gunner later said, "It wasn't battle, it was eruption. One man's plan against an army that didn't believe he was there." Data anchors from combat reports record that Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed 14 vehicles in less than 15 minutes. The town, once peaceful, became a furnace. British units scattered to the hedgerows, radios crackling with disbelief. The words repeated. Where did they come from? In the chaos, a Cromwell commander ordered his men to hold the crossroads. He saw the Tiger emerge through the smoke, black cross glinting against flame. He fired first. The shot glanced off, useless. The return blast tore the turret apart. By noon, Wittmann's Tiger was hit and abandoned on the outskirts. He and his surviving crew disappeared into the hedgerows, leaving the wreck smoking under the church tower. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise itself. A local farmer later recalled finding a British map in the rubble. On it, a penciled note read, "Armor concentration, unconfirmed." Beneath the words, mud and ash had blurred the lines. That smudged note became the first record of the missed warning, a single forgotten detail that changed the rhythm of the campaign. The strategic analysis came later, written in calm tones and distant language. Enemy armored presence underestimated, communications delayed. But on that morning, it wasn't delay. It was disbelief. The wind carried the smell of burnt fuel down the valley. Folliot's recon post, miles away, heard the echoes and knew. What had been ignored now spoke through fire. The Allies would recover. They always did. But Normandy, from that day, ceased to be simple ground. It became a test of reaction, of coordination, of trust in the unseen voice. The fields darkened again with smoke. Somewhere, church bells rang, hollow against the roar of engines retreating north. And in the distance, another front began to move. The battle had revealed more than a tactical error. It showed how swiftly victory can turn to warning once more. The smoke from Villers-Bocage drifted for days. It hung over the hedgerows, turning sunlight to ash. For every soldier who passed that road, the air still smelled of loss and confusion. It was the scent of a warning understood too late. Headquarters at Bayeux began to piece together the fragments. Messages recovered, timings recalculated. Someone underlined the phrase, ignored at 0540, enemy armor verified. It was quiet in the tent when they read it. Major General Erskine ordered new reconnaissance patrols toward the high ground. Every officer now demanded confirmation before advancing. Each hedgerow became a threat, each farmhouse a question, and behind every map line, a whisper. It could happen again. Reports indicate that within 48 hours, Allied radio procedure changed. Recon signals were no longer filtered. Every sighting went direct to divisional command. A small reform born of fear, but one that saved lives in the days ahead. Yet, among the French reconnaissance men, the feeling was different. They had been the voice unheard. Now, in the aftermath, they felt like ghosts wandering through their own proof. Captain Folliot wrote in his field log that evening, "Perhaps warnings are only heard after someone dies for them." The line ended without a period. The ink had bled into the page. Outside, the wind pressed through the canvas walls. Engines idled in the mud. A mechanic's hammer echoed faintly in the distance, the rhythm of rebuilding what had already broken. In London, analysts examined aerial photos. The German counterattack had cost them dearly. Tanks destroyed, momentum lost. But the Allies understood something deeper. Intelligence ignored is not just a failure of data. It's a failure of imagination. That realization moved quietly through the command chain, not spoken aloud, but felt. The need to listen, truly listen, to those who saw before others believed. The fields around Villers-Bocage turned green again within a week. Cows wandered past wrecked half-tracks. Children, barefoot, collected shell casings like coins. War had left its fingerprints on everything, even silence. An old woman washed laundry by a well near the crossroads. Each time a British patrol passed, she looked up but said nothing. The tanks rumbled by, louder, slower now, their crews watching every window. Somewhere in that stillness, the war had grown older. A gust of rain came that night, sweeping over the ruined town. Drops hit the broken glass, the twisted rails, the spent shells buried in grass. Each sound felt like time counting forward again. The shock had settled, but it left behind a truth the Allies would carry through every field that followed. The difference between foresight and disaster can be one unheard voice. Engines started again at dawn. Convoys rolled west, deeper into the hedgerows. The road from Villers-Bocage faded behind them, but the echo of that morning stayed. The warning had become doctrine, and doctrine, in war, is written in lives. The sky broke open above Normandy. For 4 straight days, the rain came down in sheets. Convoys sank axle-deep in mud, radios drowned in static. And all along the front, motion slowed to a heartbeat. This was the storm that trapped both armies. Allies stalled in advance, Germans stalled in retreat. The sound of engines gave way to the rhythm of rain. Each drop struck steel, canvas, and earth with the same dull certainty. Even the guns fell silent. War records call it the Great Gale. Winds over 60 knots battered the channel. Mulberry harbors, the floating ports that fed the invasion, were torn apart. Ships broke anchor and drifted ashore like ghosts of their own cargo. But for those on land, the storm did more than halt movement. It forced reflection. Men sat under tarps, smoking in silence, watching water pool around their boots. Somewhere out there, the enemy waited too, just beyond the curtains of rain. At the forward recon post near Caumont, Captain Folliot's unit stayed in place. They watched the low fields vanish under floodwater, listening to faint clatter of distant engines. Each night, they sent updates no one could confirm. Radio towers were down, wires snapped by the wind. The war had entered a pause no map could mark. Folliot noted in his journal, "Silence is the most dangerous sound of all." He underlined it twice. In Bayeux, Allied command held emergency meetings under lantern light. Supplies were rationed. Troop morale dipped. But within that waiting, something subtle took shape. The realization that victory would depend not on strength, but endurance. Technicians struggled to rebuild radio relays in the storm. Cables hissed under rainwater, voices flickered through static. Between bursts of interference, one phrase came clear from a distant operator: "Enemy armor regrouping south of the ridge." No one could tell if it was true. No one dared ignore it now. Across the sodden fields, the hedgerows steamed like breathing walls. Water flowed through shell craters, carrying shreds of paper, burnt cloth, fragments of orders once vital. And in that slow erosion, the landscape itself seemed to remember. When the storm finally broke on June 23rd, the air was still and strange. Smoke hung low. The sound of insects returned. Men emerged from their shelters, blinking into the thin light. The world looked washed clean, but the sense of waiting remained. Down by the flooded roads, villagers came out with buckets to gather what drifted in from the sea. Ration tins, planks, a broken rifle stock, a helmet with no name inside. One child found a compass half buried in silt. She held it up, wondering which way it still pointed. The Allies repaired what they could. New harbors were laid. Fresh units landed. The pause was over, but the lesson lingered. Every storm, they now knew, carried a message. Sometimes it spoke in wind, sometimes in silence. But it always warned. Engines began to stir once, more. Tires spun mud into the ditches, and through the thinning mist, the war resumed its breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge, another front waited, quiet, armored, listening. The rain ended, but the earth still held its weight. Mud clung to every wheel, every boot, every breath. And in that heavy silence after the storm, the war gathered itself again. June 26th. Sunlight broke through scattered clouds above St. Lo. Columns of Shermans and Cromwells rolled out once more, engines coughing steam from their exhausts. The men called it the crawl through the hedgerows. Each field was a fortress, each lane a trap. Records from the British Counterattack Corps describe progress measured not in miles, but in meters. Every corner demanded a decision: advance or stop, risk or wait. And each time a scout's report came through the radio, command hesitated just a little longer. Caution had replaced momentum. The ghost of Villers-Bocage followed every transmission. At a forward outpost near Livry, Captain Folliot's unit found an abandoned German half-track. Inside, a torn field map, hand-drawn, edges burnt. It showed defensive lines marked Regelstellung, shield positions, overlapping the very routes the Allies now took, proof that German doctrine had learned, too. The ambush that once surprised the British now became the German defense model itself. Folliot studied the map by lantern light. He traced the arrows, the crossings, the fallback routes. He realized the enemy was no longer simply reacting, they were adapting. just as the Allies had. Outside, the sound of artillery thumped steady in the east. Each blast rolled through the valley like a slow heartbeat. Between the echoes, a mechanic's wrench slipped against a track link, sparking in the dark. It was the sound of a machine learning to breathe again. Strategic reports from Chafe Command show that by the final week of June, Allied intelligence operations doubled. Every aerial photograph was scrutinized for armor movement. New reconnaissance aircraft flew at dawn, low and fast, through the last tatters of cloud. Pilots described the ground below as a chessboard of uncertainty. The data shifted daily, but beneath it all, one idea began to form: that victory in Normandy would not come from speed, but from exhaustion. To wear the German line thin, mile by mile, until even their tanks had nowhere left to hide. In the field hospitals, the wounded listened to rain tapping on canvas roofs. Some asked who was winning, others didn't. One nurse wrote home, "Everyone here has stopped asking about the end. They only ask if the next morning will sound the same." That line, preserved in her letter, carries the human weight. The reports do not. It marks the slow transformation of war from movement to endurance. By June's final dusk, the land looked unchanged, but in every command post, new patterns had replaced assumption. Orders now began with the phrase, "Verify before advance," a sentence that seemed procedural until one remembered what Austerlitz had once cost. The wind rose again through the orchards. Somewhere, a church bell rang for the evening. Its echo carried over the fields where smoke and rain had long since mixed. And in that soft distance, the war, for a brief fleeting moment, felt as if it were listening too. The summer light came pale and thin over the hedgerows. July 2nd, the fields near Tilly-sur-Seulles shimmered in heat. Dust rose from tank treads, hanging motionless in the morning air. The storm had passed, but something heavier remained. This was when the Germans returned in force. Fresh panzer divisions moved from Caen's southern line, their armor scarred yet disciplined. They no longer struck in surprise. They waited, watched, and punished each advance. For every field gained, the Allies paid twice in blood and steel. Reports from the 7th Armored Division mentioned ghost armor, tanks that fired once and vanished. It wasn't magic, it was method. Wittmann's ambush had taught the Wehrmacht that in Normandy, invisibility was not silence. It was survival. Captain Folliot's reconnaissance teams pushed south again. The roads they once patrolled alone were now crowded with convoys, engineers, medics, fuel trucks. War had grown louder. Yet within that noise, Folliot kept listening for the faint, familiar patterns. The shift of air before movement. The unnatural pause of birds before engines start. Those were the real signals, the kind that never made it onto maps. He sent daily updates. Tracks near La Baleine. Unidentified armor, East Ridge, dusk. And every message now received an answer. Always the same 2 words. Message received. That phrase, routine, simple, was the quiet proof that someone, somewhere, had learned. In Caen, German command prepared for what they called Operation Lüttich, a last strike west to cut the Allied line. Orders passed in coded fragments, carried by dispatch riders who rode through shellfire as if chased by ghosts. One message recovered later read, "Hold ground until opportunity returns. Silence equals strength." The irony was cruel. Both sides now feared silence. By mid-July, Allied tank crews had adapted to hedgerow warfare. Bulldozers welded iron teeth onto the fronts of Shermans, turning them into breaching machines. They called them rhinos. Each modification meant one thing. The battlefield was learning to evolve faster than orders could be written. Every night, when engines cooled, the men could hear frogs in the flooded fields, distant artillery rolling like thunder too far to place. And sometimes, if the wind was right, they could smell the sea again, faint salt drifting in from the north, reminder of where they had begun. One British sergeant wrote in his journal, "We came ashore thinking the battle would end when we reached Caen. Now it feels like the war begins again each morning." That sentence became the emotional ledger of the campaign, hope rewritten daily, in the mud. Strategically, the Allies were tightening the net. Every village taken became a hinge for the next. The German command chain thinned. Fuel shortages bit deeper each week. But beneath the maps and the math, there was a new rhythm, the pulse of adaptation, born from loss. At dusk, Captain Folliot sat beside his jeep, cleaning mud from his boots. He looked out across a field littered with broken tracks, spent shells, and the soft glimmer of dew returning. Somewhere beyond that field, another warning was forming, this time not ignored, but anticipated. He closed his journal, listening to the faint hum of engines over the horizon. In that steady, distant sound, he heard both danger and reassurance. War had learned to listen, and through that listening, men had learned, painfully, how to survive it. The wind shifted west. Light fell across the wrecks like memory itself. Tomorrow they would advance again, and this time, when the warning came, it would not vanish into static. Dawn came slow over the bocage. The mist no longer hid the fields. It revealed them. Every shape, every shadow, every sound had meaning now. The land itself had become a teacher. Allied command called this phase Operation Goodwood. 3 days of preparation, 3 divisions massed east of Caen. British armor stood shoulder to shoulder, gun barrels raised into a gray horizon. Above them, bombers waited for the signal that would open the sky. Captain Folliot's reconnaissance teams worked without rest. They mapped hedgerows, bridges, and minefields with the precision of surgeons. No more assumptions, no more static. Each message was logged, confirmed, and transmitted again until the lines sang clear. When the order came, July 18th, 0545, the sound shattered the valley. Thousands of tons of bombs fell within minutes. The ground convulsed. Barns, trees, and trenches vanished under dust. Men pressed their faces into the soil and felt it tremble like a living thing. The attack was meant to break the German hold at Caen once and for all. But beneath the thunder, something else emerged: coordination. Where there had once been isolated commands, now every unit moved by rhythm. Tanks advanced behind the rolling fire curtain. Infantry followed the line of smoke. The war had turned from chaos to choreography. Wartime transcripts from SHAEF confirm. Over 2,000 Allied aircraft took part that morning. The shockwave rolled 15 miles across Normandy. And for the first time, German radio intercepts describe Allied movements as predictably unpredictable. Even the enemy could feel the shift. Folliot's men moved ahead of the columns, eyes fixed on the ridgelines. The roads that once felt deadly now felt known, mapped by loss, secured by memory. Each burned-out tank along the roadside was a lesson written in steel. At midday, the sun broke through the haze. The air smelled of fuel and summer grain. Overhead, contrails drifted like threads across the blue. The war, for a fleeting second, looked almost still. A British dispatch rider passed Folliot's jeep, shouting over the noise. "Bourguebus Ridge ahead! Enemy falling back!" The words carried like music, but they also carried something quieter: disbelief. The warning that once saved no one now lived inside every man who heard it. By nightfall, the offensive slowed. German armor regrouped under the cover of smoke and wreckage. The ridge held, barely, but the balance had changed forever. The Allies had proven that communication, not speed, was the real weapon. Strategic reports later called Goodwood a partial success. Tactically true, but emotionally, it was something else. The breaking of an old silence. For once, foresight had outrun disaster. In his notebook, Folliot wrote only one line before sleep: "Silence no longer owns us." The ink stopped halfway through the word silence, as if even the pen hesitated before writing it again. The next morning, the mist returned, softer now, almost forgiving. Engines coughed to life under its veil, and the men moved forward once more. Their radios whispered alive with static, but this time the static carried voices. The fog that once warned had become a messenger, and through it, history began to listen back. The air turned dry again. Dust replaced mud. The hedgerows shimmered in heat. Normandy had shed its fog, but not its weight. Every horizon still felt dangerous. Every silence rehearsed. By July 25th, the Allies stood ready for something larger. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. American divisions massed near St. Lo, British armor held the eastern flank, and reconnaissance patrols, French, British, American, traced the last German strongpoints through the maze of fields. Captain Folliot's section was reassigned south, shadowing the U.S. advance. Their task? Confirm that the panzers Wittmann once led were truly spent. No one trusted the idea of a final blow. The memory of Villers-Bocage still burned like a brand in the Allied mind. At 09:38 on the morning of July 25th, the bombardment began. 1,500 American bombers swept in from the Channel, their engines filling the sky like a rolling storm of iron. The ground beneath St. Lo convulsed for 30 minutes. Men on both sides went deaf from the pressure wave alone. Reports describe it as the heaviest single-day bombardment since the war began. 3,000 tons of explosives in less than an hour. Then, a sudden silence so deep it rang in the ears. Through that silence, Folliot heard what he had once feared, the distant growl of German engines. They were not destroyed. They were moving, retreating, reorganizing, waiting for the counterstroke. He radioed in the coordinates, the old phrase automatic now. Armor regrouping South Ridge, likely counterattack. This time the reply came instantly. Acknowledged. Air support vectoring east. The change was invisible, but absolute. The same warning that once disappeared into static now summoned thunder within minutes. And when the aircraft turned east, the sound of their engines became a kind of vindication. That afternoon, German Panthers struck near Le Mesnil-Hermann. They fired through smoke, trying to catch the Americans before they crossed open ground. But this time, reconnaissance had already marked the kill zones, artillery pre-sighted, infantry ready. The ambush collapsed before it began. Strategically, it was the moment Normandy turned. The Allies broke through, the German front splintered, the counterattack that once terrified the line had become an echo, a repetition answered by readiness. When the sky cleared that evening, the sun hung low over burned fields. 1,000 small fires flickered across the valley, and in their reflection, the outlines of tanks looked like memories of themselves. Folliot stood on the ridge with his binoculars, watching the road he had once patrolled in fear. Below, endless columns of Allied vehicles moved south. Trucks, ambulances, field kitchens, mobile forges. The war was flowing forward again, like water breaking through a dam. He closed his notebook, the last page torn by rain and time. Across the margin, faint pencil marks still read, Report, Villers-Bocage, ignored June 8th. He left it there, not crossed out, not erased, because every campaign begins with what was once ignored. As night settled, the valley filled with a low hum. Not engines, but generators, radios, men talking across frequencies once lost. The war had found its voice, a voice built from warnings finally heard, from silence finally broken, from lessons written in smoke and rain and steel. And somewhere in that hum, through the long summer night, Normandy exhaled, slowly, finally, as if even the land knew that history had just shifted its weight. The fields had turned gold with late summer. Stalks of wheat rose through wreckage, brushing the hulls of silent tanks. The front line was no longer a line, it was a net. And by early August, that net began to close. The Allies called it the Falaise Pocket, a slow tightening designed to trap the German 7th Army between the Americans from the south and the British and Canadians from the north. It was strategy, pure and ruthless, but within its geometry lay every lesson the campaign had taught. Captain Folliot's men now worked alongside American armored scouts. Their orders were precise: find, fix, and report, nothing more. The war had become arithmetic. Every report, every coordinate, every message mattered. At dawn on August 16th, a low fog rolled across the valley near Troon. It looked almost like June again, but this time, the fog did not conceal surprise. It carried purpose. Within that pale veil, Allied tanks moved like ghosts, closing the pocket mile by mile. German convoys tried to flee east. Engines roared across fields, horses collapsed under artillery fire. For days, the air stank of fuel, smoke, and fear. Pilots above said the roads looked alive, lines of motion where order had collapsed. A single captured radio operator later recalled, "We sent messages, but no one answered anymore. Static had become their language." From the ridge near Chamboise, Folliot watched the encirclement tighten. He could see flashes in the distance, artillery marking the last exits. He raised his binoculars, but instead of movement, he saw surrender. German soldiers stepping from the tree lines, hands high, uniforms gray with dust. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was quiet confirmation. The same landscape that had once punished every mistake now bore witness to understanding. That victory was not the absence of error, but the endurance to learn from it. Reports indicate over 50,000 German troops were trapped in the pocket. Many never escaped. The Allies advanced to the Seine within 2 weeks. Normandy, the fortress that had defied them for 77 days, was finally open. In the ruins of Villers-Bocage, grass grew through the cobblestones again. The church bell that once fell silent rang for the first time since June. Children played in the square where tanks had burned. And somewhere beyond the hills, the sound of the sea returned, faint, distant, almost peaceful. Folliot walked that road once more, now lined with wrecks turned to rust. He stopped where his first message had gone unanswered. The field was quiet, except for wind moving through wildflowers. He bent down, placed his old map on the ground, and let the pages turn in the breeze. No ceremony, no closure, just the sound of paper in the wind, the rhythm of what history keeps and what it releases. The official communiqué called it a decisive victory, ensuring the liberation of France. But between the lines, those who had lived it understood something deeper. The warning had not been wasted. It had become the foundation for every decision that followed. Across the valley, the engines of departing convoys faded. Smoke drifted west, dissolving into the same horizon that once hid the enemy. And as night settled over the empty roads, the silence that returned was not fear anymore. It was earned. For the first time since June, Normandy slept. Morning light returned soft and amber over the ruined fields. By September, the hedgerows were thinning. Leaves yellowed early, touched by smoke and the long breath of artillery. The war had moved east, but its echo remained here, in Normandy. The convoys that once thundered past now carried food, mail, prisoners, and silence. Every village along the route wore its wounds like memory. Walls cratered, bridges half rebuilt, roads lined with helmets too dented to keep. Yet in that ruin, order had begun to return. Children played among wrecks, farmers turned earth blackened by oil. The land was remembering peace, one field at a time. Captain Paul Folliot drove alone that week, south to Caen, then toward Bayeux. His unit disbanded, his map sealed in archives. What had once been urgency was now reflection. He stopped us where the first transmission had failed. The post near the hedgerow outside Villers-Bocage. The radio tower was gone, replaced by a single wooden cross. No name carved into it, only a date, 8th June 1944. He removed his cap. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint scent of salt and engine oil. He thought of the men who hadn't returned, and the warnings they had left behind, spoken, unheard, then finally understood through loss. In his notebook, he wrote one last line before closing it forever. Perhaps history does not repeat, it waits until someone listens. He left the notebook there, wedged under a stone. The pages would fade with rain, ink bleeding into soil, already rich with memory. Some truths belong to the earth more than to the archives. Strategically, the lessons of Normandy would shape the rest of the war. Allied signal networks became instantaneous. Reconnaissance doctrine rewired from hesitation to verification. By winter, radio delays had fallen by half. Future campaigns, the Ardennes, the Rhine, would move faster not because of strength, but because the silence of June had been turned into method. Every major command training after 1944 carried the same inscription in its manuals: listen before you move. Simple, paid for. In London, Clerks filed reports into gray folders marked Normandy Communications, Phase 1. Few would ever read them in full, yet each carried a trace, a signature, a time, a phrase once ignored. Together they formed a quiet memorial to every unseen voice that spoke before the world was ready to hear. Across the channel, the fields of Normandy turned cold again. Crows perched on twisted radio masts. Rain fell softly through open roofs. And somewhere under that weathered sky, the past still whispered in static. The warning was sent, it seemed to say. Someone is always listening now. When historians later summarized the campaign, they listed tonnage, divisions, dates, and maps. But those who had been there remembered something else. A shift not in ground, but in understanding. The realization that even the smallest sound, a wire crackle, a hesitant voice, can change the course of a war. The sea wind rose again from the west, carrying gulls inland. Fields glistened after rain. And in that quiet renewal, Normandy breathed. No longer a battlefield, but a reminder. For those who came home, the sound of static became the sound of survival, and the silence that followed was peace.